Hello and welcome to this video which will show you the entire process for making perfect sourdough bread. The method outlined here assumes that you've already made a leaven from an active starter, and if you haven't, you'll need to go back to this stage. Stage 1. Mix an active autolyse. To a large mixing bowl, add 731 grams of room temperature water. Next, add 218 grams of active leaven. Look at how aerated and bubbly this leaven is, which shows it's just about ready to use. A great way to test if your leaven is ready to use is to drop a small amount into the water, like so. If it floats, as it does here, you're ready to go. Your user manual will explain what to do if it doesn't. Add the rest of the leaven up to the required 218 grams. You'll notice that there's some leaven left over, which can become your new starter if you used all of the starter to make this leaven. Just put it in another jar and start feeding it as you would your previous starter. Now stir until the leaven is thoroughly dispersed. Add 109 grams of wholemeal bread flour, (982 grams of strong white bread flour, and 20 grams of fine sea salt. Mix everything together thoroughly until you don't see any of the dry ingredients left on the side of the bowl. Let's speed this process up a little. Scrape as much of the sticky dough from your hands as possible, then cover the bowl with a towel, some cling film or a lid and leave it to rest for an hour. This rest period is known as the active autolyse process and is the first stage in the process called the bulk rise or bulk fermentation. You'll find more information about this in your user manual. After an hour, we're ready to move on to the second stage of the process, which requires us to perform a series of stretch and folds in the dough. This is a really crucial part in the bulk fermentation, which develops gluten, giving the dough strength, which will mean it will hold its shape. Here's how to do it. Wet one of your hands with water to prevent the dough from sticking to you. Hold the bowl with your dry hand, and at the 12 o'clock position, push your wet hand down between the side of the bowl and the dough. Grab a chunk of the dough from underneath, stretch it up above the rim of the bowl, and then fold towards yourself over the top of the rest of the dough in the bowl, like so. Rotate the bowl a little and repeat the stretch and fold. Repeat a further 4 times so that you've completed 6 stretch and folds. Cover the bowl and leave to rest for 30 minutes. This is your first set of stretch and folds complete. After 30 minutes, complete another set of stretch and folds. You should notice that the dough is more elastic and less sticky than it was during the previous set of stretch and folds. This is a good sign because it shows that the gluten is developing within the dough. Notice how the dough pulls more cleanly from the side of the bowl. Cover and leave for a further 30 minutes to rest. 30 minutes later, and it's time for another set of stretch and folds. Look at the surface of the dough. You should notice that it is softer and smoother than it was when you first started. You'll also notice that the dough has increased in volume, which is a sign that the yeast from your starter have begun to feast on the sugars in your flour, converting them to carbon dioxide, which has started the process of inflating your dough. Magic! The gluten is developing nicely in the dough, which means it is even more elastic than it was previously. You'll notice that it's much more difficult to stretch this time, and that the dough will have a tendency to pull cleanly away from the sides of your bowl. Now is the time to test the gluten development in the dough, and to do that, we're going to use a process called the Windowpane test. Grab some dough in both hands and stretch it between your thumbs and fingers. What we're trying to do here is to stretch the dough into a thin membrane without it tearing. You should be able to stretch it so that it becomes translucent and lets light through, hence the name the Windowpane test. If the gluten is not developed as much as it should be, the dough will tear. This isn't far off, but I decided to do another set of stretch and folds just in case. "30 minutes later, and it's time to do another set of stretch and folds and another Windowpane test. Let's see how it goes this time. That's much better now. I'm happy with that, so let's move on. Stage 5 is the last stage of the bulk fermentation, and it's called the bulk rest. Our goal here is to leave the dough to ferment even further, during which time it will expand as more sugar in the flour is converted to carbon dioxide by the action of the yeast. First of all, empty the dough into the bulk rest container. Push the dough into the base and corners of the container as much as you possibly can, which can be a bit tricky given the stretchiness of the dough at this stage. Just do your best. Once you're ready, replace the lid. The ambient room temperature will strongly affect the time it takes for your dough to rise, and because this is not something we can control for, rather than specify a length of time, we're going to use the expansion volume as the measure by which we will judge if our dough has risen enough during this stage. For this recipe, we should aim for a 25% expansion, which we can easily work out and mark on the side of the tub. Feel free to estimate this using your eye, remembering that 100% expansion would double the depth of the dough in the container. Personally, I prefer to use an equally simple but slightly more accurate method of doing this. First of all, mark the top of the dough on your container. Next, with one edge of the paper aligned with the bottom of the dough, make a mark on the paper which coincides with the top of the dough. Next, fold the paper in half at this mark, and then make another mark where the two parts meet. Fold the paper again so these two marks touch each other, and then add a new mark along this crease. Finally, fold the paper one last time so that the bottom mark and this new mark meet, and then add another mark along this crease. The top mark represents 100% expansion, the middle mark represents 50% expansion, and the mark below this represents 25% expansion. Mark the 25% expansion measure on your container and then leave the dough to rise, which will probably take anywhere between 3 and 6 hours depending on the room temperature. Sometime later, and the dough has risen by 25%. You can see how aerated the dough is through the sides of the container. Now it's time to pre-shape the dough, which builds tension in the outer skin. This is probably the trickiest part of the whole process, but with a bit of practice, you'll soon get the hang of it. First of all, wet your hand and empty the dough out of the container onto your work surface. Dip your dough scraper in water, which will help prevent the dough from sticking to it, and then divide the dough into 2 equal parts. You can move one of the dough balls aside for now while we work on the other one. With a wet dough scraper, fold the edges of the dough into the centre. Then flip it over. Push the dough scraper underneath the edge of the dough nearest to you at the 6 o'clock position. Then, using a smooth, confident motion, rotate it in an anti-clockwise direction towards 12 o'clock, finishing the move by pulling the scraper and dough back towards you. The front of the dough will adhere to the work surface, which builds tension in the outer surface of the dough. Repeat this move several times until you have a nice tight looking dough ball. Then repeat the whole dough shaping process with the other piece of dough. Note that we don't use flour at this stage in the process. Cover the dough balls with a dampened tea towel and leave for 20 minutes. This stage is called the bench rest. By the end of the bench rest, the dough will flatten and spread, but should maintain a thick, rounded edge, as it does here. If it spreads to a thin pancake, it's a good indicator that the dough has been over or underproofed, because the gluten is not strong enough to hold the dough in shape. Now it's time for the final shaping, and then to pop the dough into the proving baskets. Flour the top surface of the dough and around your work surface. I'm using rice flour here, but you can use normal flour. Attending to one loaf at a time, slide your bent scraper beneath the dough and around the edge to free it from the work surface. Then, in a single move, again using your dough scraper, flip the dough over so that the floured surface is now on the bottom. Repeat with the other loaf. There are many different methods used for the final shaping of the dough. This one's fairly simple. First of all, stretch the dough into a rough rectangular shape. You can see that this is roughly 25 centimetres wide by 30 centimetres long, but don't worry too much about that. Next, fold roughly a third of the dough over onto the other side of the dough. Then fold the other side over on top of that. You now have a long, narrow, rectangular shape. Next, starting from the bottom, roll the dough up, pulling it towards yourself as you do. This produces a thick roll of dough with a tight surface. The seam should be on the underside. You can use the scraper or your hands to pull the dough towards yourself to create even further tension in the outside of the dough. Then tuck the ends in. Flour your banneton and the surface of the dough with rice flour. Using rice flour will prevent the dough from sticking to the bannetons. Flip the dough into the banneton so that the seam is now facing upwards. We will now create further tension in the dough using a process known as stitching. You can see how I'm doing this here. Finally, sprinkle with a little more flour and then pop it into a bag. Repeat the process with the second piece of dough. I'm adding a little water to the top of the dough here to help it to stick. Next, place both loaves in their bags in the fridge for 12 to 14 hours. This stage is important. While the dough is in the fridge, it will continue to prove and rise, but much more slowly because the cold significantly slows down the yeast activity. But rise it certainly will. The flavour will also develop during this slow proving stage, the final bread becoming increasingly sour the longer it is left. Also, cold dough is much easier to score at the next stage. And now, after the final rise, it's time to bake the bread. Preheat your oven to 260 degrees centigrade or 500 degrees Fahrenheit, or as hot as it will go. If you're using a Dutch oven, place it in the oven now so it gets nice and hot. Alternatively, place a flat baking sheet onto a middle shelf and a deep-sided roasting tin on the base of the oven. Leave your dough in the fridge until your oven has reached temperature. While you're waiting for the oven to reach the required temperature, gather together all of the equipment that you will need for the next steps. You'll need oven gloves, some baking parchment or grease-proof paper, rice flour, ideally in a flour shaker, and a bread lame or razor blade. Please be very careful with this. Now we're ready to bake, so take one loaf from the fridge and turn it out onto a sheet of baking parchment or greaseproof paper. I'm also using a breadboard here, which helps when flipping the dough out of the banneton. Dust the top of the dough with rice flour. Then, using a razor blade or bread lame held at approximately 45-degree angle, score a single cut along the length of the dough, approximately 1 centimetre deep. The score will allow the bread to expand properly in the oven. I'm also adding a wheat pan to this dough, but this is purely decorative. Right, it's ready to go in the oven. I'm using a Dutch oven for this first loaf. Remove the lid, be careful, it's super hot. And now carefully drop the dough, together with the baking parchment, into the Dutch oven. Pop the lid back on and leave it to bake for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, carefully remove the lid of the Dutch oven. Look at that oven spring. Place it back into the oven and bake for a further 20 minutes at 230 degrees centigrade or 440 degrees Fahrenheit. After 20 minutes, your loaf will be baked. If you prefer a darker loaf, leave it in for slightly longer. Take it out when it's ready to your liking and leave it to cool on a cooling rack. Take a moment to marvel at your handiwork before you move on to the second loaf. You will always get better results if you use a Dutch oven, but I wanted to include the alternative just to show you that you can still bake wonderful bread without one. Here we are using a normal baking tray, which we will fill with water later to create steam in the oven. We'll also use a baking sheet onto which we'll place the bread. I'll repeat exactly the same process that I used for the previous loaf. When the oven has reached temperature, pour boiling water into the bottom tray. This should create steam, which in turn should help your bread to expand effectively in the oven. A Dutch oven accomplishes this by trapping moisture from the bread, creating its own steamy microenvironment. Then transfer the bread onto the top tray, close the door and bake for 20 minutes. Don't forget to reduce the temperature of the oven after 20 minutes to 230 degrees centigrade or 440 degrees Fahrenheit and bake for a further 20 minutes. You'll notice that this second loaf didn't quite split as effectively along the score as the other one. This was to do with the amount of steam in the oven. Nevertheless, this is still a great loaf. There you have it, 2 perfect sourdough loaves. All we need to do now is cut them open and have a look at the crumb. Amazing.